You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with David McKerracher, a man who needs no introduction. He's been on the show what feels like many, many times, but only twice, because we've had quite a few conversations. And Dave's someone I consider a friend, someone I consider an organic intellectual in the fullest sense of the word. And I think he's really earned that title with his recent book, Timenergy, Why You Have No Time or Energy. A book I just finished today. Really good book, really accessible book. I was really surprised how readable this was. I'm honestly going to have my dad read this. I think he'll be able to get through all of it except maybe the chapter 4 in the last part. I guess the first thing to get into, Dave, is the title, Why You Have No Time or Energy. Some people might just see that title who are already into theory and they'll say, well, what makes your concept of time energy different from all the people who talked about free time? Marcuse, Byung-Chul Han, Mark Fisher, millions of people talked about it. Why did you write a book on this? Why should people give a shit?
Thank you. Yeah. Well, and first of all, I just want to say that if your dad does end up reading it, let me know how that goes. I'm really curious because my dad read it and I didn't really expect that would happen the first time I wrote a book. And then when he actually did read it, I was like, oh crap, my dad's going to read the stuff that I write. That's weird. And so the fact that he found this book a lot more readable than my last one made me go, I'm doing something right. I'm kind of giving myself 5 years here before I write a truly popular book. But the fact that he was able to, for the most part, follow along is something that I take relative pride in. So anyway, thank you for having me on. Why is time energy different than free time? Right. And so I just want to, before we get into it, point at how time energy is spelled is the words time and energy together, but with one of the E's in the middle dropped out so that it is a unitary phenomenon, right? That is kind of what is being signified here. Outside of the fact that it's supposed to somehow encapsulate both time and energy, it is also supposed to signify the unitary phenomenon. And so the point is that free time is not a sufficient condition for the good life. We actually need energy. And so this is really important for breaking one of the illusions that we operate under, which is that, oh, if I just had more time, well, just having more time is not going to work. So Adam Smith, for example, he's more progressive than your average capitalist apologist today. He was for public education, libraries, and he believed that in the evenings, workers would be able to, using resources like the public library, educate themselves. And of course, to a certain extent, for some of us, that's true, right? We force it. For some of us, like I'm an Amazon warehouse worker. I also part-time at a university as an adjunct. And these are both part-time jobs that I kind of combine so that I can do what I love. And I have to really hack the system to be able to free up the relative time energy necessary to be able to do these things. But I wouldn't be able to do these things that I love, that I'm passionate about, if I hadn't have gone through a period of not having to work as much, right? And so for a person who just has to work all the time, they see something like philosophy or politics and they think that is so much effort that I would have to expend before I could stand there and seriously hold a position with my sort of intellectual conscience intact, right? They see that it would require so much. And because they don't have that much to give, they kind of come up with some things. They'll say what people say about X, Y, and Z topics, or they'll avoid those topics altogether. But to speak a little bit like Heidegger here, the horizon of possibilities has been collapsed, has been narrowed down to a life that revolves around the overwhelming amount of your time and energy in the week being reduced to labor power, right? And so Andre Gors is keen on this in his Farewell to the Working Class book, where he says that if you free up time for a single mom who's working 3 jobs, let's just say that she starts getting UBI and then she doesn't have to work. Let's say that she's working 50 hours and all of a sudden things change so that she's only working 35 hours. Extra 15 hours of freed up time is still going to go towards socially necessary labor. It's still going to go towards raising children, running errands, etc. And then even if she got passionate about some extracurricular thing that could be more than just a hobby, could be a true passion, whether it's philosophy, politics, art, dance, music, it doesn't matter. It's not going to work if she's exhausted, right? Bringing it back to Adam Smith. Yes, time that is exhausted is garbage time. And so Adorno's aware of this in his piece called Free Time. Obviously, Marcuse is aware of this. Everyone's aware of this, but they don't talk about energy. They kind of just assume it. And I think that it's not a coincidence that these great thinkers assume energy. It's because they've always had it. And so I think we can get a little too carried away with standpoint epistemology, but there's a new version of this book coming out soon with a preface by Slavoj Žižek, by the way, announcement. And in it, he says it couldn't have been written by somebody who didn't come out of the work process itself, bringing that back to the idea that they see this thing with time because they are thinking about time, they are existing in time, but they presuppose their time as energy infused kinds of time. And of course, they get it. The worker is worn down to a shadow of their self. They get it, but they never theorize it. And so that's kind of what I've taken on is theorizing it. And I don't just theorize it because I think it's important for speaking to people at a level that they find really relatable. That is part of it. Part of it, sure, comes out of organizing and wanting to talk about our reduction to labor power as a commodity on the market, to talk about what that does to us, right? And that's a way to connect with people because people are always saying, well, I don't have the time, or I don't have the energy, or I don't have the time and energy. Beyond the fact that it's intuitive and a great way to communicate with people who get it at a gut level without the jargon, the typical jargon, right? It actually poses a problem or a sort of intervention for how we think about organizing, for how we think about theory, for the kinds of solutions that have been developed so far. And so, for instance, if socialism is to be the solution, well, then it would have to be a reformed version of socialism that would actually integrate the idea of time energy. And then if the solution is not going to come from a kind of socialism that's reformed to think time energy, then what could it come from? These to me are like open questions that I leave on the table because my goal here is to get people to think about it more than to argue, well, it has to be this kind of a political party or this kind of a movement. I'm going to bracket that out and say nobody has thought seriously enough about how bottom in our lives, an absolute, I almost want to say like something that's beyond question and that everyone is going to be able to agree with if you actually say it, is that none of us have the time and energy that we need to be able to do the things that are most important in our lives. And so what time energy is this unitary phenomenon that is prior to being fragmented into random disparate time and energy, which is what we tend to experience as workers, right? We experience it fractured. And even before you're a worker, the schooling system does that to us because it's preparing us for the life of a worker. And so, yes, in a sort of technical sense, you have time energy. It's just been habituated and preordained into its organization as labor power, which has made you exchangeable with everybody else. And at that level, all that you have remaining after the work week or school week is time without energy, garbage time, or energy. You have energy, but it's restless energy because it can't be harnessed towards higher human aspirations.
And that's what you call this time hyphen energy, right? Which is the fractured time energy as opposed to time energy, which is what we all don't have, right?
Sort of. So I guess you could kind of do it like this. There's time energy, there's time and energy, and then there's time hyphen energy. And so the time and energy is when it's fractured, which is what you were just getting at. Whereas when it's hyphenated, is to say, relatively speaking, you're able to hack your way into having some kind of time energy. It's still not.
Without the blocks, right? Without like reliable blocks.
Yeah.
That's the thing you made this. I think that was the distinction at the very start that I think made it as a unique as a theory, among other things, of course. But the reliable blocks, the fact that you might have time and energy, but if you don't actually have it as a routine and the amount of time you need to form habits, it doesn't really mean anything. It's fractured. Yeah, sure, I take a vacation, I have time energy. You wrote this while in Mexico, right? When you had time energy. So that is time energy, but it's not really because we don't actually have reliable, I guess you could say. That's the distinction.
One quick little note is that I didn't write this one in Mexico. I actually wrote this before going to Mexico last year. I wrote it while I was at Amazon still. I woke up at 6 a.m. I knew I had to work that evening and it was an overnight shift. Well, I woke up at 6 a.m. I was feeling ready to go because I've been thinking about how to write this book for 2 years already. And I just sat down and I started typing and I didn't stop for 12 hours, right? When I went to work that day, I got outside of the Amazon warehouse and then I sat down and I kept writing and I was an hour late, but I kept writing and then I was another hour late and I kept writing. And then eventually I went inside into the break room because it was cold and dark outside and I still wasn't clocked in. And I wrote the rest of it from my phone after my laptop died. So the whole thing is, besides the afterward, that block of time, and it's interesting because I had been hacking my relative time energy out of things. But you're right, I never had like the repeatable, reliable blocks of time, right? And so when I say time without energy, that's garbage, and energy
Garbage
without
time.
energy, yeah, and energy without repeatable blocks of time, that's where it becomes restless. You got to think that's how we feel all the time. We feel like we have, I had some energy. If you're not exhausted, then you have some energy, but it's like a restless kind of energy. And when I say it can't be harnessed, it's kind of like those reliable blocks of time. And we're talking about big blocks of time, right? Repeat big blocks of time throughout your week that are energy infused. Well, if those are reliable throughout your week, month, year, well, then you could say, yeah, I'm going to learn the violin. And then you just start grinding on it. And you have, because of that reliable time throughout the week, month, year, something to bank on. And so it's like your obsessive sort of calling towards taking on the learning curves necessary to achieving proficiency or mastery in this task. Those building blocks, so to speak, are in place. And so that opens the horizon of possibilities for this to not be merely wishing it to be true, but you can actually move on it. Whereas, yeah, going back to you're just a student or a worker whose time and energy is completely fractured and you don't have reliable time. Your only energy is restless and most of the time you're exhausted. Oh, good luck learning the violin, much less 3 to 5 languages, much less actually getting to the bottom of some difficult thinkers or whatever, right? And so and ultimately it comes down to this, to be a human in a more full and rich sense, and which would be some kind of freedom over what you are becoming. If that is to be something beyond mere consumer curation of identity, right? If it's to actually be part of I'm making myself, right? Well, it would mean you're taking on these kinds of things that we can only simulate if we don't have the time energy, right? Whether that's being a violin virtuoso or a polyglot or whatever. There's all these kinds of things that people feel every day. Wow, I wish I could be that. But you can't move on it. Or if you do move on it, you burn out and then you blame yourself. This is meant to throw a wrench in that process of blaming yourself every New Year's when the resolutions fall through, right?
Mm-hmm. The thing with a concept like this is that it seems so simple that people might even be skeptical. They might think, well, this seems so obvious. Someone surely has thought about this before. And as you were mentioning, it's been talked a lot about. And in my videos, of course, I think you might have found me through my Burnout Society video, in which I talk at the end about free time and overcoming an existence which is only about useful and instrumental reason and stuff like that. And there's been many people who've written about this, but one reason I took this quite seriously is because I've seen you talk about time energy for years before you published this book. I think like 3 years ago, you had a YouTube video on time energy or something. And so clearly this means a lot to you. And I know you read a lot of philosophy. So I was like, clearly there's something to this. And some people might say, well, didn't Nietzsche already talk about this with otium? And you address Nietzsche at the end in some very interesting ways, which we'll get into. But in what ways does your concept of time energy differ from Nietzsche's otium? And the
It's-
follow-up question to that, which is, I have a feeling you're going to answer this as part of this anyway, which is you talk about time energy as an existential category, and time in an existential sense as opposed to an objective sense. What do you mean by that, and how does it differ from Nietzsche's otium?
It's an interesting connection. So I'll go with the first part, which is to say, so I would have done anything to know about otium prior to all the work and research that I'd put into time energy, but I really only found out about it through Daniel Tutt. And the thing is, I had even read a good enough portion of one of his primary sources for his book on Nietzsche.
Gay science?
No, the Lizardo's Nietzsche, the Aristocratic Rebel.
Oh, I thought you were talking about where Nietzsche talks about odium.
No, yeah.
Talks a
No,
lot about in gay science.
No, when I read the Gay Science like a long time ago, I didn't register what odium was. And so that didn't make an impact on me. And it's like, I don't look up every word I come across. And so it's, yeah, if the word keeps coming up and it gets stuck in my head and I'm like, what is this word? Then I'll look it up. And with that one, I did not. And so what I'm saying though, is that I forget his first name, but Lizardo wrote this book called Aristocratic. Domenico Lizardo wrote Nietzsche, the Aristocratic Rebel. And that book is, it was 900 pages. And I read the first few chapters enough for me to go, wow, Nietzsche's a lot more political than I thought. But when I read those first few chapters, because I still hadn't really registered otium and I was listening to this book in a text to speech while working, it still didn't register. It took Tutt for me to actually register it. So full credit goes to him on that. But it's when I found out, oh, it's just leisure time. Well, that's fantastic. While there was a time for me when free time, leisure time, energy meant the same thing, the theory developed. And in the last few years, especially since my thesis, right, it developed to be like, no, it's not just labor power seen from an existentialist standpoint. Now, you could say that it comes out of frustrations organizing, the fact that people were constantly overcommitting to things that they could do and then they couldn't follow through on it because jobs were constantly coming back around. And that's where I come up with the idea of, say, imagination stomachs or something like that. The idea is that you have this, it's like the kid at the buffet. When you feel energized and you forget about time energy, you are looking at the buffet of life and you're like, ooh, I'm going to get some of that. Ooh, I'm going to get some of that. Ooh, I'm going to get some of that. And you load up your plate and then you start to eat and then you realize, oh, I'm full already. I can't even finish my plate. Well, it's the same thing when we feel some energy, but we forget we don't have time energy. We start committing. Oh, yeah, I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to do that. And then you can't follow through on things because exhaustion and burnout catch up with you. Mm-hmm. So, but aside from that experience with those frustrations with organizing, there's the existential and phenomenological approach to labor power, which was what I did in my master's thesis, right? Which I'm going to go ahead and just say really quick. My master's thesis was kind of a joke. I don't put tremendous value in it. I think that degrees are a true sign of something, usually commitment and endurance. And
that's what everyone says about their masters.
It's a sign of something, but I cannot say that this was thoroughly understood or reviewed by the committee that oversaw my master's. And so, but hey, I am who I am, and I'm part of that's the experience. And the thing is, I wrote, so it's chapter 3 of Waypoint, Time Energy, an existential phenomenology of labor power, Heidegger and Marx. Because that's what it really comes out of, is the fact that I've been reading Capital and Being in Time seriously as like two of my main texts still are. And the thing is, there was a time where really, if I said time energy, what I meant was labor power, but put in existential terms. The issue is eventually I read Moishe Pistone's Time, Labor, and Social Domination.
Sorry, you should just say what labor power is, just in case anyone doesn't know.
Yeah, I'll get to it right here, actually. So,
Yeah.
uh,
I have a very diverse audience, that's why. Some people who are
yeah,
like theory heads, some people who are brand new, some people who are like people who are into politics but not much theory. It's a very big mixed bag. So I always try to not drop jargon without explaining it.
yes. Okay. So I think this is in Marx's Critique of the Gothic Program. He says, labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, and it is surely of such that material wealth consists as labor, which itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. Okay, what the heck does that mean? Well, there's an issue here because he's basically talking about this thing, we'll explain it in a second, labor power, as though it's a fundamental source of energy just in nature. And of course, we have it in some way. Well, in that case, and this is the way that people tend to talk about it, the difference between labor, which is actually doing something, digging a ditch, making a pizza, heart surgery, whatever, that's actually labor power is your capacity to do that work. Okay. Now so think about it. You could be a barista and you're not actually working because you're there, but nobody's in the coffee shop. It's dead hours. Nobody's around. Well, then why are you even there? Well, they're paying you for the possibility of laboring in case somebody walks in. Same thing with when you see construction workers standing around. It's a joke, right? Like people joke about like standing around. You see one person working with the shovel and 6 people standing around them watching. Well,
Dude, I work the most bullshit office job ever. So I get it.
it. Well, and that's the thing. I like the other day at jujitsu, the dude was like, yeah, no, man, I'm exhausted because I actually have had to work this week. Right. Because he has like this bullshit job. And most of the time, he doesn't really have to do much of any kind of real labor, mental or physical. The point is, though, the reason you're being paid that salary or wage is because you're on call. And so even I think of this like person who they get to spend most of their time however they want, but they're on call for the ambulance. And this could be at 3 a.m. What that does is it sort of shatters the reliability of the time throughout their week because they can never really plan anything outside of, say, there's certain kinds of activities they can do, but those ones that require serious planning and coordination are undermined because you're on call for the boss. And when you're on call, it's because your labor power has been sold, not your labor. The issue I was saying, though, with labor power, and this is where I started waving the book, Time, Labor, and Social Domination by Moishe Pistone, is that Marx is back and forth on this. Throughout his work, he'll talk about labor and he'll talk about labor power. And if people are interested in all of that, I have my Capital Mondays podcast series they can always check out. It's way too long and way too in-depth, and it's only for serious obsessives who want to dive in the deep end. So setting that aside, Pistone will argue that Marx sometimes transhistoricizes or seems to be transhistoricizing labor and labor power. Now, what does that mean to say transhistoricize? It's a big, fancy, annoying word, but all it means is you're acting like when you transhistoricize something, you're acting like it's always that way across all history. So there's a way of talking about labor and labor power, especially value. People who think that that value, the sole sources of value comes from labor. It's okay. Are we talking about within capitalism, or are we talking about in all societies through all time? So anyway, all of this is to say is that time energy used to mean, for me, labor power understood existentially. It's our capacity to labor. You could also say that's our capacity to do other things like create art, study philosophy, etc. Well, that's a problem though, because art and philosophy done for a wage or a salary is arguably not the same thing as done for itself. And so time energy then is the precondition for what becomes labor power under capitalism. Time energy then is the precondition. It's the resource that gets seen as and disciplined and controlled into this commodity in the market called labor power that we sell because we don't have anything else to sell. So bringing it back around to otium, leisure time. What is the difference between otium and leisure time? It's the same thing as the difference between labor power and time energy.
No, I mean
which
the
is to
difference
say,
between otium and time energy, because otium is just specific kind of leisure time to self-reflect, to learn things, to learn music, and do kind of high culture of sorts. It's basically
right?
like things only aristocrats had. But I was asking
Yes,
how that differs from time and energy.
yes, no, exactly.
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is that I'm saying that otium differs from time energy the same way that labor power differs from time energy, which is to say that time energy is a precondition for both labor power and otium.
The energy part is what's missing as the precondition to otium, no? Would that be part of it?
Well, we
Because
could, okay. When ancient Greeks or Romans used the word otium, and as says, all the elites ever cared about, and he would call them aristocrats, all the aristocracy ever cared about was otium and bellum, which is leisure time and war. Well, why do they need to do war? They need to do war to get the slaves or the resources to free up the otium so that they can live in this bubble of leisure time. Now, energy is implied from their standpoint when they say otium. Like Nietzsche didn't have to say energy because he had it. And so, I mean, arguably he was sick and blah, blah, blah. But the point is like, when you, like, yeah, it was
no, that's
implied
actually a good
because of the-
example of that's actually a really good example of Nietzsche's mental health, because I mean, what stopped him from writing The Will to Power? He went insane. And I mean, that's something to do
Right.
with energy, does not? Like, sure, he had the
Yeah,
time, but he didn't have the mental energy.
Right. And that's where we could get into libidinal economy and how when libidinal economy gets all messed up, there's going to be all kinds of symptoms, right? 100%. 100%.
I do want to clarify, though, the Heideggerian influence on your work, because in it you do make a distinction that I think is worth clarifying between existential time and objective time. Because when people talk about time energy, they might think, oh, well, what if I just had more time, like in a quantity? They think of it in a literal sense. And you actually have some very interesting insights about modern time being time being a very modern concept, the idea of objective time and clocks and watches and all of that being actually something that emerges around capitalism. But yeah, I'd be curious about clarifying that, because that is something that I think adds another layer of uniqueness to this theory.
Yeah. So I don't get super into it in the book because obviously, like you said, that's a chapter you'd probably have your dad skip. And so that's why I didn't touch on it too strongly. I do get into it a little bit more in my previous book, but that's also part of the reason my previous book was harder for someone like my dad. So the point is that existential time is something that people might call subjective time. But part of Heidegger's project is to make that distinction between subjective and objective a really troubling distinction, one that kind of falls apart, right? That is to say, all things that are valuable or valued by human beings obviously happen within what we would, in that framework, subjective, objective, call subjective. Oh, okay, your feelings are subjective, your values are subjective, virtue is subjective. Whether you do or do not like genocide is subjective. You can just go down the line and start, love, you love something, you love someone. Oh, you're in a loving relationship, subjective. And it becomes a way for a certain kind of thinker who usually hates humanity to sort of downplay and dismiss everything that makes life worthwhile by saying it's not objective. And that's what's going on there, quite possibly. So what they're doing in that situation is they are holding up whatever it is that you value as a human, and they're holding it against this metric called objectivity, which is, once again, meaningless if it's not valued by humans in the first place. So the person who's holding up that standard saying, oh, well, that's just subjective, you could turn right around and say, yeah, but your prioritization of objectivity is itself a subjective prioritization. Why do you think that objectivity is so much more important when it comes to these questions, these issues of being human? So that's first. Now, to say that time is objective, well, we have this sense that there's a linear kind of unbroken time. It goes in a flow in one direction from past to future. And it's made up of moments that gets measured in minutes and hours and years, etc. So the clocks and calendars are how we measure it. But outside of the measurements, it's real and exists on its own. And there's something to that, in the same way that there are rocks that objectively exist, whether we ever see them. The tree that falls in the woods, it still fell, and the sound waves were made even if there wasn't a perceiver to interpret the experience, whatever. No impression was made on anybody, but the tree still fell. So we could talk about objectivity in that sense. That's just not interesting, right? It's not interesting in terms of the good life. The good life is a question about humans, right? And I believe that there are facts about being human. You could say that they are objective in the sense that they are factual, but they're still reliant on the human experience, right? Does that make sense? So
Yes, yeah.
Oh.
I want to get into that because you're making me think of Badiou. And
don't.
let's go back. Let's go back into the time energy. And the point was how does that category of time being an existential category and its historical context and the way we see it now, we have a very one-dimensional view of time that we take for granted.
Right.
How does that tie into your whole theory?
Here we go. So going back to this idea of this linear chain of time that just goes on indefinitely, it's infinite from the beginning of the Big Bang until the heat death of the universe. It's just this linear, unbroken chain. Well, we experience it in what Byung-Chul Han calls point time, right? Which is just to say a series of nows. Heidegger also calls it the now this, now that, now this, now that. It's just like this series of nows. Well, that's never been the kind of time that is meaningful for human beings. The kind of time that has always been meaningful for human beings, it varies across cultures. It varies depending on the structure of the civilization, and it's all these other kinds of factors that are unique and kind of dialed into the idiosyncrasies of the people in question. To speak very broadly, we can say, opposed to this modern capitalist linear time, there has always been instead what is experienced by human beings as cyclical time, repeatable time, right? And it's without cyclical time, there can be no rituals. So let's go with one that everyone's familiar with, the Sabbath. That can hold a whole people together that are all working different jobs, but they all say, nope, we're not going to work on this special day. Well, if you don't section off a special day on a weekly basis, you're not going to have much of a community, are you? Because people are going to all kind of get caught up in their own things. They'll never really able to get together and get on the same page. And so for Byung-Chul Han, ritual then is this kind of repeated time. It's where it's event centered, right? Well, capital doesn't benefit from that. And so what we have instead is a kind of time that has been chopped up into the most fungible, most exchangeable kind of time possible. And then we have been trained to try to always be the same, right? We're supposed to kind of average ourselves out so that we're always able to kind of perform the same way given any minute of time, hour to hour, minute to minute, through the schooling system and the work system. We're basically supposed to kind of always be on call to leap forward into action, to do some specific task, any given moment, any given hour. Okay. And so that's this linear point time as opposed to this repeatable kind of time. So obviously that goes to the definition of time energy, which is large, energy infused, repeatable blocks of reliable time throughout your week, month, year. And so the whole Heidegger thing, I don't want to, like you said, you have a very diverse audience. I'm a big nerd. I like to understand and also critique Heidegger. And I have a whole lecture course on him, and I'm about to finish teaching that this year. In the next 2 weeks here, I'll be done teaching it. But being in time is a huge can of worms. And I do want to answer the question though, just to say that Heidegger was one of the first people to really think about existential time in the way that I'm talking about here. Byung-Chul Han has popularized it, but it was Heidegger that really made the contribution originally. He pioneered it. And that is to say, it's not just time that's repeatable. And that's what existential time is. It's also that time is variable. Fixed time only comes about as our default setting for how we think about time with the invention of the clock. And the clock did not invent fixed time. The clock conformed to and reinforces fixed time, but fixed time was already something being developed for the sake of production. I cite Foucault on this, and also a very important passage on abstract time in Moishe Bassone's Time, Labor, and Social Domination, if anybody wants to get deeper into that.
I mean,
Yes.
that might be a good transition actually into schooling and like how that shapes time and energy. But I want to point out something that you just alluded to, which is a crucial thing, being that we can't really have time energy, even if we have time energy, because if others don't have it, it doesn't really allow us to do the things which time energy would allow us to do, which is build meaningful relationships, do group activities, learn tasks. And I mean, really, even intellectual pursuits all require groups. It requires mentorship. It requires studying with people and whatnot. And you will give a lot of relatable examples when it comes to interpersonal relationships and the way that time energy can seriously affect that, and how people will just, I mean, when you have time, they don't, and they will. You see this with with parents, how acknowledge stuff you did, but they don't really have the time to really pay attention, so you don't really get that. And you use this term. I use it more in your previous book, but you mentioned it here in the way towards the beginning. Structural stultification. The way I understand this, it's like a euphemism for saying time energy makes us like just like really dumb or like underdeveloped. What do you mean by that?
It is funny, but it is also sad, and it's true. And it gets at one of the most important things I think about the sort of injustice and oppression faced by people whose entire lives have been reduced to labor power. And that is, yeah, we really are made stupid. Here's an example. Most Americans, the overwhelming majority of Americans, are monolingual, but I've only met a handful of Americans who wanted to be monolingual. Overwhelming majority of people I've ever met in my life would like to speak at least one other language. Well, guess what? Most people on the planet speak 2 to 3 languages. Now, that's by necessity. Obviously, that has something to do with imperialism, blah, blah, blah. We export Hollywood, and so everyone's, and obviously to do business, like it's the English language, but also increasingly Chinese now. But that is the fact that people want to be able to play musical instruments and speak multiple languages, but these are the kinds of activities that you cannot undertake and sustain without large energy infused repeatable blocks of time reliably throughout your week. Same thing goes for developing a relationship with your child. Same thing goes for developing an intellectual relationship, meaning that someone who's mastered a field is able to work through your work and say whether you did a good job or not. So of course we can get
recognition from those who did
recognition. Yes, exactly. So recognition. I think that recognition is one of the most important factors here, which is why when people find themselves with a lot of extra time and this restless energy, that's not enough to fuse it back together again into relative time energy, because you have to have some potential recognition, which is to say people who will understand the work that you put into it. And I use the example of, okay, let's go back to the violinist. Okay, I can play a simple song, E-I-E-I-O. I can play this on my violin. Okay, people will go, wow, the violin now, right?
I'm just trying to imagine that on the violin.
Yeah.
Just
I know that's actually like that.
bad
It's
example.
actually, I know it's a terrible example. Let's just say, I don't know, a pop song.
YouTube videos. This hit home for me because I've noticed people don't really understand what it takes to make really good YouTube videos on dense subjects. And
Yep.
I honestly, I get tons of comments all the time, like that are very positive, and it just doesn't affect me. And if I get a negative comment, it affects me. But the positive comments that I get when I got it from, for example, people I looked up to, who I think make good stuff and have put in the effort, when they see it's, or very smart people, like when like you or Mikey will say like something I did was good, I'll be like, yeah, because these people are about that life
Right,
and they
right,
can
right.
recognize it. Or someone, it's not hard to impress someone who doesn't have that frame of reference, like you were saying with the bizarre violin example.
Well, the point is, if let's just say that you became an absolute virtuoso at the violin, your average person is not going to be able to recognize how much work went into achieving that level. The only person who's going to be able to really recognize it and acknowledge it would be a person who's also done that. And so when there's not very many people who are doing the things that you love and you can't coordinate with them, you can't organize with them, even if they respond to you, they're not able to truly show up. I mean, the fact you just finished this book, this is like the running gag is like nobody has the time and energy to read the Time Energy book. But that undermines, going back to Heidegger here, the horizon of possibilities. Because the thing I want to say about existential time, temporality, as he calls it, is it's never just time. It's that we exist with a horizon of possibilities and that we find ourselves at some point in our life with a bunch of habits and a bunch of ways of projecting ourselves forward. So he says we're always out ahead of ourselves, right? We're always out ahead of ourselves doing certain things. And so you find yourself studying for something, majoring in something, working somewhere, living somewhere. It's like you chose it. Maybe if you're no longer a child, you chose it. But did you really choose it? You don't really know what the alternatives were because you haven't really had the time to experiment and to be able to to see what other possibilities there are. For instance, I know very few people who actually read autobiographies or memoirs or biographies. Those are one of the only ways you can really think through possibilities. Of course, you could read novels and that'll give you some kind of an idea about like possible ways of being. But when you're reading accounts of real people who've actually lived and you're finding out about their lives, it actually gives you new ways of projecting onto your horizon of possibilities that is truly liberating, right? And in this way, Heidegger says you can choose your hero. Right? So, and a very liberal interpretation of that is to say that whether it's Gandhi or Mother Teresa or MLK, these are just kind of Americans project these possibilities. They choose their hero and project that possibility, that possible way of living. And of course, that doesn't mean much if you haven't taken the time to really get to know that person's life and to really understand the struggles they went through and the actual possibilities they have. Because there's one way of reading history or a biography where you're reading everything as it was necessary. It was determined. It was fated. Another way of reading it is to say, these are all possibilities that were made actual, but it could have been different. So when you start to think that way, you start to realize, well, my life is made up of a bunch of possibilities that could have been different. Getting outside of metaphysical questions of determinism versus free will, getting outside of that from a strictly existential standpoint, you're only able to project the possibilities that you've thought through or that you've seen, right? And of course, you've seen the possibility of being the president of the United States. Every kid grows up being told they can be whatever they want. But in reality, no, you can't just be whatever you want. It actually requires being born into the right family, being born into the right class, being born into the right race. You go down the line, there are all these factors that foreclose certain possibilities on your horizon. Okay, structural stultification of time energy, bringing it all back to that because that's what this is about, forecloses your horizon of possibilities. So stultification is this fancy word that means the state of being or a situation or an action causing one to become stupid or foolish or unsound. And so, of course, instead of calling a person stupid, to say that person's ultimately stultified is true. To say structural is just to kind of be redundant because the word stultification kind of already includes the structural aspect because it's the situation that is resulting in this. So let's use an example. If you spend all day, every day of your life doing the exact same motion over and over again, and you're working 17 hours in a factory just doing the same motion over and over again, and you don't get new information, you don't get new possibilities to think about, you don't get serious engagement or critical feedback, you don't have potential recognition, and you're just doing the same thing over and over again, how many thoughts are you going to really be able to have? And how dumb will those thoughts be? How repetitive will those thoughts be? Now, as an Amazon worker, I can speak to the 1/3 of us. I think this is my my armchair sociology here, but I think 1/3 of us as Amazon warehouse workers are sneaking earbuds at work. 1/3 of us are listening to audiobooks. We're listening to One Dime Radio. We're listening to all kinds of things, right? And so, of course, some of those people are just listening to music, but hey, music's sure a lot better than just the same old thoughts echoing through your head, which aren't even your thoughts, but they're things you overheard other people saying, and now you just keep thinking, why did that person say that? Or podcasts and audiobooks allow us to inject something new into ourselves while we're doing those dumb, repetitive tasks. But when Marx was writing, that was not a possibility that existed. When Adam Smith was thinking, oh yeah, well, they can educate themselves in the evening, this was not a possibility that existed. And I'll close out by just saying it's not as good. Listening is still not as good as getting to actually sit down and read, but who has the time energy for that?
Right. Yeah. Now there's a lot of ways we could get into that, but I just want to speak to the interpersonal relationships aspect because I think that is one of the biggest cases to be made for time energy because one can say, well, why do we want to free up time energy? Who is to say that will be good? What if everyone uses their freed up time energy to start more fashion brands that nobody needs, or to watch Netflix all day, or watch porn, or God knows what? The Well, like as you were saying, at least a percentage of people will be able to actualize talents and intellectual potential that they wouldn't otherwise be able to actualize. It opens their horizon of possibility, or as Marcuse would say, potentiality, or Deleuze would use terms like that too. I think, honestly, after reading this, I'm like, you should reread One Dimensional Man. I think you'll appreciate it more because he talks about the foreclosure of potentiality at the level of thought itself due to the way we understand reason and how this is interconnected also with the economy. But the interpersonal relationships is so true because you think about how much of that suffers due to time energy. Like, I noticed there's always a sacrifice when I tried to, ever since I recently have been trying to really start making One Dime like a full-time thing. I've noticed just like interpersonal relationships. I just don't reply to people, and it's been weeks, and I already had this problem before, just like working part time and like studying, trying to balance these things. One of the things suffers, and it's social life for me was always what suffered the hardest. And I found during COVID, because I had this like another job lined up for when my contract ended, and this was like during right then COVID hit, right when I was supposed to start. So I had this 2.5 month, almost 3 month period where I was unemployed. I got like money from the government, Canada. They gave everyone unemployment checks, the stimmy checks. I know a lot of people who did all kind of different things with this, but for me, I started this channel. I mean, I did something which was in the back of my head, but I didn't like ever really have the time to take it seriously. So I mean, it's very true, but not everyone does that. So it's easy for us to say, oh, if only we had more time energy, we would do so much more. If only certain people we know might have this. But what is to say that this is necessarily good for society? Now I'm kind of doing a little conservative sort of devil's advocate argument here, which is the antidote that you typically hear in response to things like giving people free stuff or whatever, which is
Right.
what's to say that if we have more time energy freed up, that people won't just waste the time or won't just be, as conservatives would like to say, degenerates. And to be fair, there's a lot of people during COVID just spent like watching Netflix, and we see a lot of middle class and upper class people who use their free time to make travel vlogs or stuff that's not, they might have time and they might have energy, but they don't use it like otium. So one is relieving time energy for everyone, essentially really good for society, or it will lead to more laziness, as the conservatives would say. And the related question to this is, if time energy was such a big factor on constraining potentiality, then how come you, Dave, how come me, were able to do what we're doing? How come you, while still working at Amazon, are able to do what you're doing? Maybe it leads to the cream of the crop if you actually have these.
Yeah.
That's actually what the neoliberals come out and they outright say that, like Hayek and Mises. They say that economic hardship breeds like the strong and the most talented, because they say like you need economic suffering because people who will rise out of it are the most cream of the crop. Like, what is your like response to all of that?
So there's a real kernel of truth in that concern because a lot of people have experienced it firsthand. They go, they think, well, if I had more time, I would just be more self-destructive. And they're thinking from the standpoint of a life that has been habituated to its reduction to labor power, meaning that when they aren't doing labor power, and by the way, when I say doing labor power, I think that it actually requires psychological preparation to go to work, right? And so there's a kind of steeling your mind and preparing yourself to go to work. And so this is where Adorno really emphasizes the word recreation. When we talk about recreational activities, what is really going on there is the recreation of what? Labor power. And so, so a recreation, you go camping or you play a bunch of video games and binge Netflix.
Lying on
pizza,
the beach. That was his example. I remember that.
Yeah, right. And so it's like you're obligated to rest up so that you can come back to work prepared for another week. So this is not a free, comfortable, unconstrained kind of existence that he would refer to as leisure or otium. No, this is what he calls free time, which is kind of a joke, right? This is not free. It's still in reference to the clock because you're still preparing yourself to go back to work. So there's actual physical energy that you have to recuperate, especially if you're blue collar. But if you are blue collar, white collar, it doesn't matter. No matter what, you're going to have to psychologically steel your mind, prepare yourself to go back into that. Working for someone you don't like. Even if you love the job, you're psychologically preparing yourself to focus on that instead of your children, to focus on that instead of your spouse, to focus on that instead of community projects. And so my point is that people are habituated to being this way. And so, yeah, if you did free up everybody, all of a sudden people would sit around and people would just, they'd watch more pornography, they'd play more video games, they'd be binging Netflix, maybe they'd go to the dog park and they'd actually talk to some neighbors. But are they actually going to take on serious, higher aspiration types of activities? Even if they try, the chances are they might not be able to do it. I'll get to the whole question of why are we so special or whatever in a second. But what it really boils down to, I think, is education and the fact that the institutions are not preparing us to be able to pursue our higher aspirations or capacities. It's not helping us discover our talents. It's asking us what we want to be when we grow up. And when it's asking us what we want to be when we grow up, there's two things going on there. One is you're free to choose. And the other one is you better choose. And when they say choose, they're saying a kind of job. And so the whole system in your whole life, you're being groomed for that exact kind of outcome. And then people are like, well, and I use the example of a father who I know, someone I really look up to in many ways. But I use this probably in the first chapter, I think, where he said that after he earned his first million, he was going to invest it all and he would just use the dividends off of that to live, and he would retire young. And so he was going really hard into real estate. He was working a pretty high earning salary and investing, putting everything into these real estate investments. And then a few years later, he said, I'm never going to retire. And I was like, I thought you said after you made your first million, you said you would never, or you would retire and spend more time with your kids. And he goes, I've already made my first million. That's what he says. I've already made my first million. The thing is, I know myself now. And the thing is, when I have more time, all I do is play video games. And I don't want my kids to see me that way. I want them to see me working. And it's cool, man. If the option is your kids get to see you being the boss man, going around, getting things done, getting after it, versus just playing video games all the time, well, then sure, you should choose the former. Absolutely. I mean, because you're trying to think of how to be a good example, and they're not going to get ahead in life if all they ever do is play video games, right? Like, I get where he's coming from. I'm empathetic. But the point is, he's thinking from the standpoint of a human being already broken. He's already structurally stultified. That's the position he's taking up when he says this. It's not just his imagination's not radical enough. It's too realist. His imagination is structurally stultified by our reduction to labor power the way everyone else is. So then that brings us to this question, what makes us so special? Well, we're lucky in that our drive, to talk in terms of like psychoanalysis, our drive hooked into the thing that we're doing. And when drive hooks onto something, everything else is going to it'll fall away. You'll find a way. You'll be able to wrestle from everything, the relative time energy necessary. But I don't think that drive would have latched onto these things if we weren't introduced to these things within a context where we already had some freed up time and energy, and then potential recognition, right? It was finding people who were stoked on the thing, whether it's philosophy or politics or something else, finding people who were stoked about it and learning to desire the way they desire, because desire is desire of the other. And if all you've ever had are people who, when they're not working, they're drinking or doing substance abuse or shopping, and that's all they've ever done, and that's all you have as far as social reference points go, how do you think your desire is going to develop? And then where's your drive going to rebel? If people are showing you how to be a good worker, how to be a good student, how is your drive going to rebel? Well, it's probably going to rebel by smoking pot. It's probably going to rebel by doing graffiti. It's probably going to rebel by getting into some kind of edgy way of dressing or some edgy way of listening to music or some edgy way, but it's going to be consumer based. It's not, and I'd make this distinction between a consumer activity that is just you pay money and now you have the thing as your identity versus something where you can't just pay money for it. You actually have to put your time and energy where your mouth is, right? So you buy the violin, but you can't buy being a master at the violin. The only thing that's going to buy you being a master at the violin is sustained effort over hundreds of hours. Well, that requires time and energy.
You did a perfect segue there into the part on drive and desire, libidinal economy, which I think is a chapter that will actually be a little difficult for people who aren't as well versed on Lacanian psychoanalysis. And that's something I've been into the past 2 years, and I'm very interested in it. And I thought this section was interesting, and it reminds me of this conversation I had with Michael Downs, Dangerous Maybe. He was in the podcast that I did also with Dave on accelerationism. I call Mikey the real life Goodwill Hunting because it's kind of wild that he has literally didn't even graduate high school. He got his GED, but didn't even graduate high school. And this guy is so well read in philosophy. It's insane. And he's like friends with Todd McGowan. He had breakfast with Zizek and wild. So I asked him once, I said, Mikey, I get how I, like during COVID, was able to read as much as I did. How the fuck do you read all of that you did while driving trucks? Like I was able to read while working like office jobs and shit, while, on the job and like having PDFs. How did you do this while doing these like much more blue collar jobs? And he was like, nah, it's got nothing to do with like my intelligence or anything. I'm lucky that my jouissance is tied to this. And that really made me think, because I thought that about myself too. I'm like,
Yes.
oh
exactly.
yeah, that's why I'm like good at learning theory really fast and stuff like this. I'm just mentally ill and I channel it to this.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so so that's perfect. This is a difficult word. It's super obnoxious to hear a word like jouissance when you're just out in the wild and then you're like, oh my God, what the fuck is that? Well, it's quite simple. Jouissance is the opposite of calm, peaceful pleasure, but it's still a kind of pleasure that is kind of intense, adrenaline rushing even, right? You get some kind of intensity from it. And in fact, that intensity and that potential adrenaline comes from the fact that you're undermining your calm, peaceful possibility, right? And so this is just to say, it's the difference between desire and drive. And so I chose not to really use the term libidinal economy in this book because I thought, oh, well, that has the connotation of sex. And I don't want to get into that whole thing where I have to explain why this is a term that gets used seriously by psychoanalysts. And so instead, I'm just going to focus on the two aspects of what gets called libidinal economy that I take the most seriously. And that's desire and drive. And so instead, I just called it desire drive economy. And the point is that in Lacanian analysis, or in the theory, the things that we desire are mostly like pleasure focused in terms of we want to be successful, we want to be happy, we want to eat a good amount of food and then be satisfied. We're not trying to be gluttons. We're not trying to be excessive. We want to be balanced. We want to be whole and balanced. This is what we desire at the level of what they call the pleasure principle. Well, drive is this rebellious, transgressive kind of impulse to take whatever it is that we desire and go too far with it to the point where it actually undermines the pleasure principle. And so that's where Freud changes his whole trajectory in his work by writing Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And it's this idea that we have this thing called death drive. Yeah, we have this life drive to do pleasure things, right? To avoid pain and to do pleasure things. But we also have this impulse to sabotage that. And so a perfect example is, well, you're just trying to make a good impression on your kids. You want to be a good example. But here you are doing road rage, driving recklessly. Why are you doing that? Well, you have some rational story about why you're doing it. It's everybody else's fault. If everybody just drove like you, then you wouldn't be so upset. But in reality, because we're always trying to do the pleasure thing and avoid the pain thing and live in a sort of comfort bubble, there is this sort of welling up of rebellious intensity, and it has to go somewhere. And drive finds an outlet that's a reliable outlet for that to go. And by kind of releasing that, you get this thing we call jouissance. And it's your whole society is telling you to do something, and you're kind of rebelling against that. That's what you're doing with your YouTube channel. That's what I'm doing with philosophy. That's what Mikey's doing as well. And so Mikey's whole life, everyone's, well, you're just some high school dropout, good for nothing, little wannabe gangster kid. That's kind of the way people saw him, treated him when he was a teenager. And on his 21st birthday, he said, I want to be smart. What am I going to do? So he walked his ass into Barnes and Noble, and you know the story, right?
Yeah,
He
yeah.
goes and so he gets into philosophy that day. And the thing that he'll be the first to say is, when it comes to time energy theory, the reason he is so for it, the reason he's 100% for it, there's a wonderful quote on the back of this book that I'll read by him. The reason he's so into it is because he had it. As far as a human being can possibly have their time energy, he had it in a way that nobody else has had. If you earned good grades and then you went to college, even if you get into philosophy at that point, you don't really know how to exist in otium. And that's because you didn't ever have time energy. Even when Mikey was just effing off, doing whatever he wanted, being a high school dropout, hanging out with his friends, and being getting into trouble, being some kind of what happened was that he had the relative time energy to collaborate with other people, which mostly just meant listening to music and walking around and talking, right? But at the point, and playing games and watching movies and doing the kinds of things that 90s kids, 80s kids and 90s kids did, right? Well, because he had that potential time energy, he was able to say, I'm going to get into philosophy. And when he decided to get into it, he got into it. And then he was sitting there 6 hours a day, every day for 15 years. Why? Well, it's because the unique kind of job that he had at the time didn't require any serious kind of labor or attention. He just pretty much held down a desk and he just got to go and read. And so if it wasn't for this idea of being a smart person who reads philosophy already being in his head, if it wasn't for the relative time and energy he already had, and if it wasn't for certain people he met along the way, none of these things would have coalesced into what he ultimately became. And for people who want to know, like at this point, we've talked about him, just look up his blog, The Dangerous Maybe. But here's the quote he wrote. He said, the concept of time energy opens up a new theoretical space for the critique of capitalism that provides a field of rich possibilities for a spirited coalition between Marxism, existentialism, structuralism, and psychoanalysis. The heartbeat of the future itself has stopped. The concept of time energy is CPR. He lives this because he had it, and then he had to start supporting his mom. So the job he had worked at was his mom's company. But that company, due to a whole series of things, ultimately did not continue to exist. And so now he supports her, and he can only support her by working full time. Working full time, he doesn't have the time and energy to do almost anything. But after he gets off of work, he still goes to the coffee shop for at least 3 hours, and he still works on his blog. And I still got him to teach a couple of courses. But you know what? If it wasn't for that 15 years of relative time energy that he had prior to entering the workforce, we wouldn't know Mikey the way we know him today. He wouldn't be able to do the things that he's able to do today.
And what's so interesting is that actual philosophy professors, just most professors I knew, in grad school, none of them have time energy. They're always on the run. They're always in the hamster wheel. They can barely even reply to emails sometimes. And Mark Fisher has this excellent bit in Capitalist Realism when he talks about how academia has just become so bureaucratized and all of this unnecessary labor that gets piled onto professors, and even worse if you're like an adjunct or a non-tenured professor where you basically have to do so much work that you really shouldn't be doing. The profs should just be teaching and doing research, but you have to do all this insane stuff. So as a result, a lot of them don't even publish books. I was shocked by how so many professors I knew didn't barely publish anything. And well, when I say they didn't publish the books they wanted to, they had to publish tons of things. But for the academic rat race, which is publishing tons of things to be competitive on the very difficult market in academia, which is so hard to get hired, and you're having this real, I think, stupefaction of academia where so many smart people, their potential is just being totally squandered by all this stuff that they have to do. They have barely any time to actually do research and pioneer some really great works. So many of the greatest minds I know. And yeah, I mean, you would think also like PhD students, you would have so much time you're getting paid to study. Oh, you're like, must be so easy for you, eh, buddy? But nowadays, you have to, like, a lot of what you're getting paid for your PhD is you have to teach courses to even get that. And usually that doesn't cover your life, your basicness, barely covers your basic necessities. You have to get another job. You have to find another way to get money. And it's just, you actually barely end up having time to do anything outside of that. So you end up just being like a regular worker who reads more. So I mean, it affects people at not just the working class level, but in so many industries now because of, I think, the intensification of labor, which you talk about a lot, and why Keynes was wrong and why Keynes couldn't really, why his prediction was wrong, and why Marx can't explain this phenomenon of this intensive labor, and why not actually, despite us becoming wealthier, not more of us have had more time energy, but the actual opposite has happened.
Right. Well, and that's because our technological gains go towards, well, if it goes into automation, what kind of automation? It's the kind of automation that's meant to make it so that me, as a worker, I am now overseeing a bunch of machines, right? So the easy example is the clerk at the grocery store who's, instead of running a cash register, is overseeing 15 self-checkout stations. Well, when I'm working at Amazon, the job is about as idiot-proof as it could possibly be. I take the thing from here and I put it there, and that's pretty much it. It's like matching. It's like matching colors. It's like, I learned how to match colors when I was like 3 years old, I'm pretty sure, maybe earlier, right? It's the same. It's so a 3-year-old, if they were big enough, could do this job at Amazon. That's where we're going. But the thing is, it's like what
working produce in a grocery store.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that person has when I'm working there, though, I've replaced a ton of people's jobs that have been sort of de-person and put into this general form of intellect, right? This is artificial intelligence, and I'm working in its heart. That's how I see this warehouse. I walk inside of artificial intelligence. AI is just an extension of that. And the thing is, the book I'm writing about this, it's about the idiot-proof future of work. And there's the idiot-proof job at Amazon where I can listen to audiobooks, but there's another kind of idiot-proof. It's really sad and soul-sucking. It's more stultifying, in fact. And that is the kind that still requires your actual attention. And so grading people's ChatGPT written essays, because I work at the university as well part-time, and I'm reading people, man, there are some really bad things that I'm reading on a daily basis when I'm grading. And it's not just structural stultification. It's to the fact that people are not being equipped. And when they are equipped, there's not reliable, repeatable, energy-infused kind of blocks of time with potential recognition. That is to say, other people who make it matter. And so you get people writing like they're 5-year-olds in college, or they use AI. And here I am grading them. And so, of course, what am I doing? I'm using ChatGPT to grade them. And so ultimately what I'm doing is I become the overseer of robots at Amazon and the overseer of robots at the university. And but the problem is that still requires more of my mental resources than Amazon. It's just more soul sucking.
Service work in that regard, especially ones where you have to be highly social, those are the worst.
Right.
The worst job I ever had was being a camp counselor.
A what?
Like for a camp counselor, like where with kids
Oh.
and stuff, where you have to have like enthusiasm when like leading group. That was the most soul sucking shit. I mean, well, there's worse. Being office job feels more useless, so that's sometimes that can be worse, but it's not as draining because you can avoid being social more. Whereas if you have
Right.
to have that social energy, it's honestly, I'd rather just lift tiles.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. And that kind of cheery energy is now expected of the management, right? And so you're not just the manager who tells people, get back to work. You're the manager who says, be your best self, right? And Mark Fisher talks about that, of course. And he talks about the amazing shift from sort of the movie Blue Collar to the movie Office Space. I love that chapter. I think it's chapter 8 of Capitalist Realism. But Zizek, in the preface to this second edition of Time Energy, talks about the three kinds of exhaustion. The first kind of exhaustion is just physical exhaustion from doing a repetitive thing all day. The second kind of exhaustion is the one that you were just talking about, which is care work, empathy work, having to be, if not energetically like enthusiastic about things, encouraging people, high-fiving people, then you have to be like listening and fully tuned in. Versus the third kind, which is arguably more creative, and it actually involves like prestige and possible serious gains, is a kind of creative problem solving kind of work, right? And so you might be on a board of trustees, you might be some big capital investor with some kind of a huge portfolio that you're managing. So there's the first kind of, and that's the monotonous kind of repetitive labor. And that's obviously exhausting physically. And it can also be mentally exhausting to some degree. Then there's care work, like you were just talking about, right? Empathetic or enthusiastic kind of work. That's obviously very emotionally draining. And that's where we talk about emotional labor, which also obviously happens outside of the workplace. But no, then there's also the third kind of energy that Zizek talks about, or sorry, third kind of exhaustion that Zizek is talking about. And that's the exhaustion that comes from creative kinds of jobs, creative kinds of work. No, the third kind of exhaustion is the kind that comes from problem solving and creative problem solving kinds of work. This is the kind of work that might be, relatively speaking, fulfilling and kind of bring some degree of prestige. In fact, going back to my episode on the PMC, to some degree, this care work versus this creative problem solving work, both of those are being cultivated through college education today. You're supposed to have both of those capacities. And then, of course, like if you're going to be a city planner, or if you're going to be on some investment firm, right? Well, then obviously it's going to be this creative problem solving, as opposed to if you're a nurse or a doctor, then you're going to be a lot more in this kind of care field, or a psychologist, or even a lawyer. Think about how emotionally exhausting being a divorce attorney would be, right? It's like that's soul sucking. And so, but that's kind of where Graeber with bullshit jobs comes in, because there's a lot of these kinds of jobs. When we say soul sucky, as Graeber says, what makes it soul sucky in the first place is that your whole life is revolving around something that you're pretty sure isn't important or necessary. In fact, you don't see the point of it. And maybe the world would even be better if you weren't doing it, right? That's the worst. And so when Zizek lays those out, my point was just to say that the second and third kinds of exhaustion are ones that are more faced by people who go to college, as opposed to at the Amazon warehouse. It's just the physical thing. It's the being on my feet all day thing. But here's the unique advantage, historically speaking, where we are today. This new opportunity is that the people who are saddled with the most debt, but also potential prestige on their horizon of possibilities, the people who are supposed to be doing the readings, are often the people who are doing the least when it comes to the reading, because we're seeing a transition, and people like Mikey and myself are indicative of this change. And that is the 1/3 of the warehouse workers who are stealing their attention back and focusing it on podcasts and audiobooks. And Zizek talks about that being some kind of a special possibility now today as well. So I keep waving around an old edition of this book because the new edition's not out yet, but I'm hoping that by the time this podcast is published, the edition with this preface by Slavoj will be available on Amazon and at theoryunderground.com. I think the most important thing is there's never going to be a radical overnight transformation of society. And if there was, if it was too fast, even if it, I'm not talking about revolution reform. I'm just saying transitional institutions are necessary, and that those institutions are not just re-education or something like that. The point is that we actually need institutions that are able to show people the value of things that are good in themselves. And that was supposed to be the idea of the university, which has become a job training ground under the neoliberals phase of whatever. What we need is time energy institutions. We need actual institutions to rise up, to lead the way, to show people what you can do, who you can become if you actually get your relative time energy. And it's already kind of happening because everybody wants to be a YouTuber. Everybody wants to be a TikTok. People see people living a different kind of lifestyle than they are able to live. Before YouTube and TikTok, it was celebrities already kind of gave you this ability to go, wow, what if I could be like that? Now, of course, it's some kind of superficial, shallow, oh, I just want to be beautiful and pose at the beach and kind of go to parties. Anyway, look, what I'm trying to say is when people see your video essays and they go, wow, I want to read that. Now there's this instant sort of reaction. I can't read that, or I wouldn't have the time, or I don't have the attention, or I've got ADHD, or people have all these things because we're structurally stultified. We are being realists about our situation, but seeing other people do something can make you want to do it yourself. And so doing it as individuals that are kind of making it happen, that's one thing. It's a whole other thing when there's an institution that models that and really lays that out as its mission, its vision, its purpose. And that is one of the big parts of Theory Underground. Now, Theory Underground is not my end goal. It's my 5-year plan. The bigger plan later on is a real institution that would model this and help other people with this. But right now it's about my own education and me getting to lecture on the things that I'm interested in. But the fact is, people see us going hard, reading Capital on videos anywhere from 2 to 6 hours, doing 9-hour streams. And people are like, oh my God, what the hell are they doing? How do they have that kind of energy? And it's, well, I've hacked the system to be able to have as much as I do have. And there's the drive component. But outside of all of that, I believe that there's a genuine good in showing people what can be done if their relative time and energy is freed up. That's why, that's part of the reason I want to be multilingual. Outside of the fact that I think it will help me be a better thinker, that it will help me read some of the texts that I really care about in their original languages, connect with people when I travel in a way that goes beyond mere tourism. I also want to be able to model, because I will probably have children at some point. I'm also an uncle. I want to be able to model the fact that, hey, look, even some dumb fuck kid from Idaho, me, can ultimately become something if you just free up the relative time energy and you prioritize these higher aspirations over the profit motive and over the job path. Institutions. We need the kinds of institutions that are going to help people do that and not just tell them that you can be anything you want to be as long as it's a job.
Yeah, there's something that you segued to, which I wanted to talk about earlier, but I think it might be better to talk about it in the Back Room podcast. But there's something very interesting in how you start off your book. It's in the first 3 chapters about slavery and leisure and school, and the way these terms were defined, and how slavery had a very different meaning for the ancient Greeks, and that slavery, essentially meant dependence on economic necessity, bare life, synonym you use, not just the fact that you're literally enslaved. For them, they thought it was either you're free or you're a slave. It wasn't like some in between. So in the sense, we're all kind of enslaved to the system if our main preoccupation if our preoccupation is with getting coins to go live in a box and eat munchies.
So that's preoccupation with necessary labor. That was always the definition of slavery. And the point of slavery was to make it so other people would be preoccupied with the necessary labor so that you could be free. And so the free men of Athens presuppose the slavery of the women, children, and actual slaves who are won by conquest in their quote unquote economy. Well, this is problematic, of course. It's also where the idea of freedom comes from for us. And so what does that mean? Right? It means that substantial freedom has always meant having your otium. But the precondition for otium is time energy. And that has to be freed from labor time.
Yeah, and you quote Jefferson actually, which it's not cool to to say Jefferson had anything radical to say because he owned slaves. All
Yep.
of them did back then. But you said that for Jefferson, freedom meant being able to develop your higher human capacities.
I got it from a class I was in. A professor was talking about the Jeffersonian vision of America. And I was just like, well, what is that? Because people say that. And he was like, it's you work, but you don't work so much that you don't have time to spend with your kids. And there's kind of this assumption that to have that democratic element, people have the time to sit around in the evening and read Plato and their King James Bible or whatever. And that was the kind of ideal at the time. And it wasn't just his idea, but he does articulate it in his work.
I do know like the vision of Jeffersonian democracy broadly was that pretty much everyone would be a property owner of some kind. And it's weird because you might think that was dependent on slavery. And even though he owned slave, he actually has writings that say he believed slavery was going to end like fairly soon. Like he thought it was going to become a thing of the past.
Right. This is where I am being controversial by saying that Jefferson's more progressive than any of the presidents that we've had in my lifetime. Even if, let's just say, it was all hyperbole, it was all idealism. He's on the one side being a literal slave owner, on the other side, he's saying, hey, well, we could work less and we could have time to read Plato with our kids. Okay, well, guess what? Obama didn't say that. George Bush didn't say that. Trump didn't say that. That's my point. My point is simply that they all talk about jobs. They say, we need more jobs. They're not saying we need more leisure time. And of course, saying that we need more leisure time, like someone like Jefferson apparently did, or like how Keynes thought we were going to have at this point, or Andre Gores was hoping we'd have at this point, it's not enough, right? That's why I think we actually have to understand time energy. And we have to understand how the kinds of gains we get from technology, from our labor-saving devices, aren't really socialized, or they're not turned into commons, right? So if we're freeing up our time and energy instead of making it so that one person is doing the job of 10 to 20 to 50 to 100 other people, then yeah, we would start to see this move towards something like a leisure society. And hopefully, if there was a big push in that direction, and that's obviously my lifelong goal, is that there is a push in that direction, part of the transitional society would involve, on the one side, kinds of automation that are meant to free people from subjugation to labor and preoccupation with necessary reproduction or whatever. And on the other side, actual institutions for time energy expenditure, which is to say, places where you can learn to be autonomous or collaborative, to take on amazing things that you would never do if you're exhausted all the time.
Yeah, and that brings us to the topics that I wanted to talk about in the back room, which involve, well, school. That's the whole topic. Because school, for those who don't know, at one point meant leisure. That's the etymology of the term. That's fascinating for those who haven't heard that. And I want to discuss the ways in which school affects time energy, and more importantly, like an alternative, because you talk about the problems with people who think homeschooling is a solution, and because they presuppose time. And what the other things I thought were really interesting is time energy fragility, and the interesting way you were able to link that to cancel culture and sort of what people call today a wokeism or whatever. I think time energy fragility is actually a pretty clever way of dealing with a whole wokeness thing that doesn't really play into the progressive conservative spectacle. And I also want to talk about that whole concept of coolness and indifference. I thought that was a very relatable chapter, actually, and touches on something that I think is very great because I hate irony. I hate post-irony culture, how it's like uncool to take anything seriously now. And you relate that to time energy, which is really cool. And I want to get into the solutions. That's the big thing we're going to talk about in the back room, because about the limitations of democracy in the workplace and full employment and stuff like that. And the big thing is the whole Nietzsche debate. Was Nietzsche onto something with otium? And what is a new concept of nobility or a hierarchy in a post-capitalist world? So that's what we're going to be talking about. Yeah, stay tuned for that. Become a patron if you're not already. What are you doing if you haven't already? If you listen to this show every week, if you got the bones, if you don't got the bones, respect, just give it a 5-star rating. Helps out. But if you have enough, helps the channel greatly and gives me some more time energy to not sell out.
I'm just gonna say, you got the bones, 100%. But also, if you don't got the bones, go on one extra DoorDash drive and then donate it to Tony. I'm for real. I don't know. Just find a way.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.